Hello, everyone. Hello. I think we have a very chatty room here tonight. Hi, everyone. Sorry to interrupt great conversations. Welcome, everyone, to the Art Institute. I'm Sarah Guernsey. I'm Deputy Director and Senior Vice President for Curatorial Affairs. And it's my honor to welcome you to tonight's program. H.C. Westermann's work combines a graceful command of materials, rough physicality, wit and wordplay, and a sensitive worldview shaped by both the horrors of wartime and the devotion of love. He used a wide range of materials, but was most dedicated to woodworking, once saying that wood was his whole life. The exhibition H.C. Westermann, Anchor Clanker, my favorite title of all time, is the largest gathering of the artist sculptors in Chicago in over 20 years. It is presented on the occasion of a transformative gift of 17 Westermann sculptures from the estate of Allen and Dorothy Press. As a result of their generosity, the Art Institute is now the most significant repository of Westermann's work, allowing us to highlight his legacy for audiences for years to come. To the Press and Goldberg families, which I see many of in the audience, my deepest thanks. We're thankful for this remarkable gift and for what it does to grow our collection and to engage visitors. So many, many thanks. Tonight's program is generously sponsored by the Carol Given Winston Fund for Docent and Patron Education. Carol was a member of the museum family for 38 years, and the fund bearing her name was established to inspire those who share Carol's love of art and learning. We're honored to have many of Carol's children and extended family here with us tonight as well. So if you haven't already seen it, I invite you to view the exhibition in Gallery 227 at the top of the grand staircase. The galleries are open until 8 o'clock tonight, so we invite you to view the show after the end of the program. This exhibition was beautifully curated by my colleague Giampaolo Bianconi, our Dittmer Associate Curator in Modern and Contemporary Art. Joining him in conversation tonight about Westermann are two incredible artists, Ingrid Olson and Richard Rezac. Please join me in welcoming our discussants to the stage.
Thanks, Sarah, and thanks everyone for coming. I'm Giampaolo Bianconi. I'm a curator here at the Art Institute, and I'm very grateful to Ingrid and Richard, who are both fantastic artists in their own right, for agreeing to join me tonight for this conversation. There's a number of things about Ingrid and Richard's work that I admire. And that shares some qualities, I think, with Westermann. But the reason I invited them here tonight is because they're both very good lookers. They're very good at looking at things, and it's fun to look at things with them. So I'm excited to look at these works with you, so to speak. And quickly, I just want to say something about Westermann himself. Westermann was a complicated man. He served in 2 wars. He had the kind of, the soul or the spirit of a poet, the work ethic of a craftsman, and he dedicated his life to making very enigmatic objects that I think are difficult to understand. They don't carry meaning very easily. I think that's one of the things that we're going to talk about tonight. And he dedicated himself to making these beautifully crafted objects with really lustrous exteriors that seem very self-contained, but I find very difficult to penetrate. They're hard to get inside of. They're kind of like perfect little boxes, and some of them have doors and hatches and holes and different ways of getting inside, but it's not always clear how accessible they really are. So maybe to start, I would just pose a question to both of you, and I'll ask questions, but I hope that we'll just talk and you can ask each other questions or ask me questions or whatever you feel best about. But what do you make of works of art that have so many openings, literal physical openings, so many holes in them, so many entryways, and so many of them that we can't really access?
I thought you were going to go for it.
Well, I can give it a stab. I mean, I think the nature of sculpture typically, until, I suppose, Henry Moore introduced voids, holes, Barbara Hepworth. Obviously, there were always figurative sculpture before the 20th century that had limbs stretched out, and the Roman marbles, obviously, in this museum, show many of those kinds of things. My point, I guess, is that sculpture typically is a core. It's solid, marble, wood, maybe something cast, bronze that is hollow, but in fact looks to be solid. So in post-World War II, obviously that changed dramatically. So when you say Westermann sculpture, it has holes, has access points, like a cabinet, you can open a door, whether it's sealed shut or not. That is a newfound situation for sculpture. And I suppose it's in line with assemblage, cubism, assemblage, and the kind of explosion of parts that somehow are then put back together. And that's in line with Westermann's approach of picking and choosing elements, putting them back together again, constructing boxes that are undoubtedly hollow, but they're closed. So, I think with him, there's something maybe more, within these secret spaces. We know there's a hollow, but we don't know quite what's in there, like a keepsake. The boxes contain things. Many of them have a glass front. We can actually see them, but others don't. So there is mystery, great mystery that's consistent with his work generally.
I was happy. We talked a lot about function when we were walking through together, in terms of especially the hatches, just that some of them might be for pulling things apart, putting things together in the final installation. But when I think of, I guess, all of the hatches and holes, I kind of start to think about, it's funny, we were just talking about piercings, but I think like the human body has functional holes all over the place where there's a clear function. But then for decoration, for social purposes, we also pierce holes, for pleasure, for accessorization. And I think that there's both in his work, but I think there's something really, I'm thinking of in particular the rotting jet wing work, because when we were in front of it, we kind of were talking about, Richard, you mentioned maybe this is from a branch and it had a hole in it, and there was kind of this how it was made. But to me, I was like, this is like a figurative sculpture with an anus and a penis. It's just very clear to me that that's what that was. But yeah, then it's how did it become? Was it in the wood and he found it, or was it created?
Yeah, I think you're right. If you make a box, obviously, you either put a lid on it and you can't see inside, or you make a kind of wide frame, put glass in front, and you can see inside. So just the nature of cabinetry is, a skin and an interior. And I think, what Sarah said at the beginning, that wood, I forget the exact phrase, but wood was his life, or his, the material that permeates his entire, weekly procedure of making work through his lifetime. And if you are late 20th century making things in wood with sheets of plywood or planed wood, you are making things with voids, whether you decide to make a secret compartment or not.
The work, Ingrid, that you were talking about, the rotting jet wing, was just on the stage, and you know, wood is a challenging material to work with in many ways. It's very soft, and Westermann throughout his career was much is made of the relationship between his work and figuration, sometimes strange figuration. People see figures in the sculptures sometimes when they're not figurative at all. But the work really has the sensuality or the consistency of a body, and things are very much proportioned to his own body. Westermann was a gymnast. He wasn't the tallest man, and none of the works are really that large or that much larger than his. What do you make of this the kind of sensuality and eroticism that he brings to this material, wood?
Well, it was funny. When you were saying this, hadn't thought about it before, but when you said faces and wood, I suddenly thought of the series of photographs that was shown maybe 6-8 years ago at Corbett versus Dempsey of Barbara Rossi's found driftwood, and they were so faces. And she was always trying, I was one of her students, she was always trying to find faces and see images that were in things that people may have not intended. But as we were going through, I have never carved wood in my life. And I think the thing that it was closest to me was thinking about kind of a collaboration with material, so that there's something found, say it's a knot in a piece of wood or the shape of something that he seems to be very attuned to, that I identify with. Because I feel like I've heard things of marble carvers having to deal with this, where there's like a fault in the stone or maybe a knot in the wood that you have to work with rather than around, because these things are kind of stronger than the image that you have in your mind, maybe. And you're a carver, so maybe you can speak more to actually, technically.
Well, it's true. I mean, wood is sensuous, and anyone who, whether you're building cabinets or a wood carver, forming wood in any way, your hands are all over it. And it's the grain, I suppose, depending on the wood. If it's cherry wood, the grain is tight, and it's harder than pine or fir. So some woods in their own nature are difficult or easy, consistent, to carve against the grain. Which brings up the subject of his plywood pieces, which in some way I hope we could get to, which is different than the blocks of wood that he did carve. But you're right, it is sensuous, it's warm, never cold, and it invites this kind of slow treatment, I think, of any number of sharp tools that would form it. Sandpaper is, it's kind of a rude ending, I think, to wood. Wood really wants a sharp edge, and so that the grain is respected. Sanding is just a kind of violation, I think, and it's true.
What do you mean by that? Sorry, can you say a little more about that?
Well, you sand something and it doesn't, you think you're leveling it, but in fact you're just promoting the contour. You're not straightening it. With a saw or a knife, you are. And it seems to be, while it may sound violent, you're taking something away, you're also exposing the grain in its completely consistent way. Sanding is just a kind of scuffing of it,
And I think the piece that's on screen now, Hutch, the one-armed AstroTurf man, is an interesting one to think about in light of what you're saying, because it contains two very different uses of wood by him. You have this boxing glove head, which is kind of beautifully articulated and beautifully worked on. And then you have this hand that seems almost underworked in order to exploit the natural knots and lines of the wood that he had with him that seemed to be fit almost only for a hand, right? So there's this interplay in his work of making something out of material, but then also kind of respecting the material to such an extent that it can only be what it has to be. There's a collaboration with the materials, as you said.
That hand is exactly what I thought when that word came to mind, just because there's so many little areas that you can tell the wood probably revealed itself as that shape, rather than trying to like mimic a lifelike hand or, yeah.
Which is something he certainly had the skill to do, but sometimes chose not to do. And I think something that gets lost in a lot of the conversations about Westermann's work are the specific decisions he was making. It's so related to his mastery of materials and his craft and choices that seem kind of almost inevitable if you're trying to make something really well. But the fact of the matter is that he did make very specific decisions when he was making things, and sometimes they were odd decisions.
Yeah, and maybe one of the most peculiar and inexplicable, confusing to me, is the rotten wing, which is embedded in a green sort of felt. It's actually hollow. We had the benefit of standing up with socks on and looking through it. But this, what seems to be, and I'm not convinced it is, this sort of branching out that's truncated, that's like it's an orifice, but it's what a tree naturally does as it grows and it spouts more and more branches. On the opposite side, the confusing thing is this element that's organic. It's like a twisted fat finger. Throughout a number of the sculptures, he has these interesting cartoon-like crease lines that you get when you bend your finger. But this thing is not a finger, and it also has a hole in it. So the whole thing is hollow from top to the sides. And I don't know what the form is. It's held very beautifully with 4 brass screws or nails, brads. Maybe it's an indication of a missile on the wing that's all kind of distorted or flaccid. But that is one of the strangest sculptures amongst the 17 that I have no explanation for.
Margaret, could I ask you to please go to the image of the rotting jet wing, if that's okay, because I also think it's very much one of his more enigmatic works, even though it's also one of the works that features most centrally text. It's clearly labeled. It's labeled along the bottom with rotting jet wing, and almost all of his works are labeled or captioned in the form of an image or a cartoon or a museological display. But this is specifically what you were talking about, Richard, and also Ingrid, this kind of ambiguous thing that I don't really know what that is. Yeah.
I mean, you said flaccid. I said like...
Yeah. You can see it more clearly here. It looks almost like like a nose that's been punched or something. It has a fleshy articulation, but it doesn't seem to really be anything.
Yeah, and I think throughout Westermann's work, he was so branded by the war. And I think when he did illustrate, or in his letters, his drawings, and his sculpture, when he did engage images of airplanes being crashed and these death ships, or ships coming apart, or whatever it was. The sculpture next to this is the death ship with the crashed plane with bullet holes in it. So he always, it seems to me, treated these images of war as though he was destroying them. They're not clean. They are distressed. And so maybe if it is a missile, you see missiles on jet planes that are about to be sent off somewhere. If that's what it is, then I can maybe think he has squished it. He's made it ineffective.
And that's something you see here too, like if you look at it in the show, you can see it even more clearly, but the plane crashing into the ship has almost the consistency of flesh. It's not really breaking apart, it's kind of folding up the way a body would when it hits something else.
I think just thinking about these two works together, we had talked a little bit about cartoons, and I think this is something where it's like the fleshiness of that crumpled airplane is an effect of kind of minimizing and reducing the information in terms of conveying that. And of course you could do it a little more crumpled, but I think that's something that's really present in his work that I find, I don't know, we've talked a lot about like how he doesn't fit into categories and all these kind of things, but I think he's very much using a lot of like minimal tactics, but with kind of cartoon aesthetics to get at really difficult subjects.
What do you mean by minimal tactics?
I mean, like some of the things are minimal sculptures, and then like minimal treatments of materials, and kind of minimizing the amount of information or the amount of treatment or decision in an object, maybe letting it be what it is. But I think there's a simplification of material and information in the work that helps with the digestion of how awful some of the subject is.
Well, Margaret, I'm wondering if you can show us an image of a work called Homage to American Art, which is dedicated to the sculptor Ellie Nadelman, which is what came to mind when you were, to me, what came to mind when you were saying that, because there is a simplification of information going on here, and this is a work that consists of a found object, a found handle for what used to be a shovel, I believe, and it's affixed to a ball, and there's some kind of question of minimal sculpture there, or of truth to something that has been found and already existed. But there's also a very kind of simple, there it is, there's also a very simple kind of one-note joke there, which is that this work is a shovel. It has the handle of a shovel, but if you tried to shovel anything with that, it would be completely inadequate. And I wonder what you make of the humor. I mean, a lot of the humor is actually not really that funny when you think about it. It's very, I don't want to say juvenile. I mean, there's a lot of very dark work, but a lot of the works that are funny are kind of, they're funny in a very simple, cartoonish way. Mm-hmm. This looks like it could be an object from a cartoon.
I mean, there was just something very simple that I read. I think it was Dennis Adrian, that I can't take credit for it, but he said you enter looking at them with a funny ha-ha, and you leave going funny ouch. And I think that's a very simple, like you can approach really difficult subjects, and it's still with humor, but I think, yeah, they're really tough. And this is totally violent. Like basically the one thing that it looks most like is maybe like a mace or something, It's like, what would you do with this object?
It's a weapon.
Yeah, it's a weapon, it's not a tool. So.
Well, you made a comment about minimalism, and I would agree that throughout many of his works, if you think of them as assemblages, individual parts that add up to something together, there is, in this particular work, several things. The shovel handle, the version of lead, small one that you see now, the ball, which really makes no sense, the frame to hold it up on a kind of display hook. So there are 4 or 5 things there that isolated are minimal. You put them together and it's a complicated sculpture that seems to be an incomplete sentence. And often I would, his work in the past, and I think not so convincingly has been compared to Joseph Cornell and his boxes. And if Cornell did something similar, took a lot of scraps and constructed some sort of theme within a box, of which there are about 30 or so in this museum. They range incredibly, but nevertheless, there's a sensibility that carries through. I think a little unlike, well, considerably unlike Westermann, with more variety altogether. But that aside, Cornell gathered things. He didn't make things, he gathered things, and he made a scrapbook. I think Westermann built or made every single thing, excepting those found objects like the door handle. There are other found objects that he incorporated within his sculptures, but by and large, he made things individually, probably with the aim to put them all together. Cornell, I think, just gathered and shuffled through and put them together. So I see a stark difference between the approach of both of those. Even though they both call up a kind of reverie, a kind of a sense of, what is this? Because they are made up of fragments. And so the minimalism, I think, is true for Westermann because each part is a simple thing. But then taken together, they're not that. They're complicated.
Both of your points raise an interesting issue for me, which is that there's a lot of category confusion when it comes to Westermann. Almost every major group exhibition or theorist who tries to define a style in the 1960s specifically, and in the 1970s to a certain extent, whenever they're trying to define a movement or a school of artists, Westermann seems to fall among them, no matter how different they are. He was included in the Art of Assemblage exhibition. Donald Judd termed him under his umbrella of makers of specific objects. He was included in Documenta 5 in 1972 among many conceptual artists and other kinds of artists. He was included in a number of exhibitions related to pop art. Even though his work is kind of none of those things, it seems to be porous enough to, when someone's trying to construct an image of something, he can kind of slot right in. And I think part of that has to do with what you were saying, Richard. Every part taken on its own has a kind of different meaning, but when they're put together into one object, it becomes a very ambiguous, strange object that is much more difficult to find meaning in.
Is that a question?
I don't know. Yeah, not really, no.
Yeah, he is an oddball artist. I mean, I find it really difficult to come up to any sort of conclusive summation because there is great variety. And I think overlapping these, boxes, these very pristine mirror boxes, which we haven't gotten to yet, but they are really at one end of the spectrum. And then these plywood chunks, that he laminated and then carved with very regular profile. The big change is here, but he did others that are sensuous, I guess, rope-like, very, very thick rope-like configurations that have a kind of slow animation. They're monumental in size, and then they're compounded by these striations of plywood that there's a logic to making something that way, but again, they're very surprising that someone would think to do that. So to think to do that is something that I think Westermann, is always giving us. And there's that pause of, why, what?
The Big Change, Margaret, is maybe a work we could talk about, this big knot made of wood. And he had a kind of interesting technique for that. You mentioned his as a laminated plywood piece. I wonder if, Richard, you would be willing to describe a little bit the process that he took to make that, as far as you understand it.
Well, I'm only guessing, but what logic tells me is that he would, understand at the beginning, roughly speaking, what it is the configuration is going to be. He would cut a series of rings of plywood to save material, come as close as possible to the ultimate profile, but it would look like, a serrated version of this, maybe an inch outside of the profile he eventually carved, not with chisels, but with rasps, because it's irrational to carve plywood because the ends, they chip. And so, with a fine rasp, like a file in effect, but for wood, he would shave it down to that profile, and that would be that,
But this is also like there are pieces of wood that he's made plywood, like he's glued it up himself, right? So it's not like plywood pieces, it's wood.
Yeah, this would be probably, I'm guessing, maybe 90 or 100 or 120 rings that are in succession.
Yeah. And this was a piece that was very important for a number of artists. One of the artists who was kind of obsessed with this piece for a period of time was Bruce Nauman. And he made a work based on this piece called Westermanns Ear. So he looked at this thing, which it's unclear what it is. I mean, it could be a knot of rope. Some people say it signifies the union between Westermann and his wife, Joanna Beale Westermann, a kind of metaphor for marriage and love. There's lots of social changes in the 1960s. The big change could be a part of that. But Bruce Nauman was able to look at this and see something very different, which was an ear dangling on a rope. So he made this sculpture, a work that consists of a rope with a little bronze ear, and he called it Westermanns Ear. And I think that the ambiguity of what these forms are was very inspirational to a generation of artists. And even though the works are labeled, I wonder if we can talk about that a little bit, about the writing on them. The writing doesn't necessarily make them more clear. The writing is, in fact, sometimes just as ambiguous, if not more so, than the form, or it's unclear what function the caption or the writing serves.
Yeah, I mean, we talked a little bit about poetry, which I think that these are very poetic objects on their own, but then especially with the language, there's some moment of almost like the object and the title pointing in opposite directions, and a sense of like, maybe they have double meaning, but I think they also just have such complex meaning that maybe they have many more meanings than two. Once the things are combined, it's like there's the assemblage of forms, but then there's also the assemblage of image and kind of, I don't know, what's trying to be relayed in the sculpture.
I also think there's a very specific kind of writing he engages in. If you look at like these mirrored boxes that we were talking about, this is an example of the back of one of the mirrored boxes where he's done something that he does in a lot of his works, which is list all of the materials that the work consists of, how you would care for it. He says very clearly, handle carefully, what the finish is, where he's made it. But I mean, it's on the one hand, it's generous. It's nice to know what the thing is made of and that we should handle carefully. But can you think of any other ideas why someone would write this much information on the back of an artwork?
I don't know of anybody who would do that. And the other intriguing thing is that in most instances, those areas that we can see that are not painted or scrawled, they're stamped. That's a very permanent way to letter, to label, to insignify. In some cases, they're dedicated to his family members or somebody. You stamp it in and you emboss it in wood. You can't erase that. If you put a printed paper label, which most artists would do to identify it, that can come away. and you don't know what was there. But, I mean, he made his work. The dovetail corners are the perfect example of somebody who takes an awful lot of time, unnecessarily, one could argue, to miter a corner. Those are very time-consuming, and that's for strength, durability, permanence. Whether you glue those miters or not, or the dovetails, they are very, very long-lasting. And so by embossing or impressing with stamps or burning into the wood, there's no way you're never going to see that in the future. So I forgot the question.
Well, fragility is not something that he embraced as a way of making things. He didn't want them to be delicate, or he clearly didn't want there to be risk of mishandling or anything. But I mean, part of the reason I asked is that one of the things I see when I look at this much information is a profound distrust of other people and the world and institutions. I mean, there's a sense that he was making something in a very particular way. He made it very well, he made it to last, and he kind of didn't trust the world to care for it properly.
I love that Richard says, I don't know who would do this, because when I first saw work like this, I was like, oh, this is such an inspiration to me. Because I think, I make instruction manuals. I do a lot of things like this, but they will get lost. They will not, this is a part of the work. And it's in the artist's hands, so you can't ever get rid of it. And I think the first time I actually saw it was Jim Nutt's paintings, which must have maybe just on their own or maybe been inspired by this practice of Westermanns. But I think the thing that it really struck in me was maybe kind of less of a, pessimistic distrust in institutions, but the focus on care for the object. And I think that you see that in all of the work, where I start to see a fabricator that I have worked with for many, many years gave me one of my very first sculptures in this beautiful container. And I was like, this is so nice. And he said, every object should have a home. And I think that has stuck with me. And I think the more you care for these things, and so I love a good crate. I like to stamp them and make them hopefully a little art object so that people don't throw them away. And I try to do things that are not dissimilar from this, but I think he does kind of, on sometimes a practical level and then other times more symbolic, where there's a form that's put inside a case when a museum would also then put a case around it in some instances. That is happening in this show.
As we have upstairs, if you want to go see.
And I think there's something, even if it's, I don't know if the function is talking about museological experience from him, or if it is functional in terms of, I have this thing and I want to make sure it's protected and it's shown in this exact way, and these are the proportions, and nothing can come any closer than this because this is where the glass panes are. But I think it reminds me of, I just heard a story about a teddy bear repair, an antique teddy bear repair company. But this woman was saying that she actually opened a box, and one of the teddy bears had a little sack of food with it because someone wanted it to have food for the journey. And I think that there's some things that happen like this in the work where it feels like it's got the hatches, it's got these care moments that some artists might cover up or hide. And instead, it's all of the care mechanisms are very visible. And they're very the teddy bear is fed, I think.
Certainly fed, I think, in Westermann's works. There's a work called, Margaret, there's a work called The Wet Flower I wonder if we could look at, because it's one of these interesting museological diorama displays, in part because there's something that happens. Corona? I'm not, yeah, nice try. I wonder, Margaret, there's a work called The Wet Flower that I wonder if we could look at, because it's one of these interesting museological display boxes where he's done something which I think is difficult for Westermann to do, which is make something that looks damaged in a way. It looks hurt. It's not something, I think that Westermann, because of his dedication to materials and to craft and to making something so well, he had a hard time depicting things that were broken or not in a perfect state. And in this work called The Wet Flower, he made one of these display boxes, but he wanted it to look like the inside of the display box was wet, like there was condensation on the inside. And it strikes me as, I don't know how clear it is to see from the image, but you can see this wooden flower that has lacquer dripping from it, almost like it's wood. And when you look at it in the galleries, you can see it kind of in this image a little bit. There's some fuzziness or haziness on the glass. It looks like there's some condensation on the inside.
And a few bigger drops.
And a few bigger
Of
drops.
something.
Of something, yeah. And it strikes me also that these display cases are not just a way of preserving something in a perfect form, but also preserving something in an imperfect form. But this is also a time when a lot of artists are questioning techniques of museological display, proposing different versions of how institutions might operate, or creating institutions in their own art. And I wonder to what extent Westermann might be a part of that or something.
Well, I'm thinking of the crates, I think, is a pretty, for someone who's crafting things and, can you hone wood? Honing the wood? Stone? I don't know. Honing is for stone. Whatever. Sanding the wood, however improperly. But I think then you have well-made crates, but crates that are crates, like functional crates as the plinth for the sculpture. And he did that within his own lifetime. And then they stay with it because it's a part of the work. So again, genius. But I'm like, it feels very incongruous, but also then I think points to the idea of function in his work, even when it is non-functional art. Because there's these little hints at something that does something and serves a purpose included in the artwork.
And just to clarify, Westermann made almost all of his own crates, and he had the habit during his lifetime of using them as plinths on which to display his work. And we've done that in the show where we could. Yeah.
Well, a wet flower, I mean, it is quite literal. The varnish that's too much and it drips. And then the kind of sense of condensation on the glass, which, yeah, you can't see here, but certainly the actual work. But also rain is indicated on this field stone, which when you read it, to me it's a kind of aphorism, I suppose, of his work altogether. It's a very serious set of lines, and then a kind of matter of fact, but it also rains. I mean, there's glory, there's pain, universal human condition. And then, by the way, it's raining, or it does rain, or that's a matter of fact. And I think the kind of contrast, the kind of conflict in his work is always this, tragedy, that he experienced. And then, like you said earlier, the joy, the love of his wife, the great time that they spent, for 25 years or so before he passed. But I think his sculpture always does have this bittersweet aspect of including both. And that stone, in simple few words, I think gets to that.
I think that's really true. I wonder if we can talk a little bit about the next work here, which might be my favorite work in the show, which is a sculpture called Little Egypt. And as you can see it on the screen, it's a door. It's a fully functional door. You could open it on a wooden pedestal. You can see those dovetail joints that Richard was talking about on the front of the pedestal. But I am often asked what this work means, and it's a question that I have a really hard time answering. There are certain references. Little Egypt could mean a number of different things, but I find myself feeling like Westermann just really wanted to make a very good door. I wonder what you think about that.
I think this one puzzles me in terms of if it's something more than like a really well-crafted door, but I think the thing about this work and many of the works in the show that I love are things you cannot see, unfortunately, as a viewer of the exhibition, but the instructions on the top of the door, there's no back because you can see it in the round, but there's instructions that say keep the door closed. So it's functional, but it's like I think that there's really funny hints at, but why? So it's you can open it, but don't display it that way. I just think it's very funny. But we were talking about how nice it would be if you could have like views of all of the backs of things and there's a lot of information that is missing, unfortunately, but it is in the catalog. But, it's like to walk around them was a real pleasure.
But to what extent the information is actually missing, I think, is an interesting question. Is it missing, or is it just not for us to access? I think remains to me an open question.
Yeah. I don't know if you have any more thoughts about the door.
Not much more than what you've said. I guess the love of making something well, and also non-usable, non-functional. It's shorter than, unless you're 12 years old, you can't walk through this door. And he was short in stature, maybe 5'6", 5'7". Maybe it's a tongue-in-cheek joke on himself. Who knows? But there is reason to make something like that, I suppose, for its own purpose, and do it like you would otherwise see a door of regular size. I don't know. There has to be a reason.
Do you know what year he was building his house? Like, do you think this would have had some relationship to that?
Yeah, it could have. That's an interesting question. It could have been something that
super direct.
He wanted to try out making for the house, and then didn't. Wanted to have a trial run for the house.
Yeah.
And that brings up an interesting point, which is that Westermann made a lot of sculptures. He was a very prolific artist. About over 300 objects that we consider, capital A art. Sculptures, but he also couldn't stop making things. He made gifts for people, sometimes in their own beautifully designed, elaborate boxes that he would send them. He was very known to give people dustpans that he would make by hand as gifts, containers for other things. And he also built his own home and studio for him and his wife in Connecticut. And I don't think he saw a distinction between any of those things necessarily in terms of how they were made. I certainly don't think he took any of his objects that we would consider sculptures less seriously than anything he considered a gift or when he made his house. I think it was all just one field of production for him. So it makes sense that something that he would have tried making for a house could have become a sculpture or vice versa.
Yeah, one other thing, going back a bit to language, imprinting his name, his signature, the title, directions for care and materials used. There is, in my view, this parallel of caption, image. And he drew his entire life, I think biography such that his sisters talked about him always drawing as a little kid, and he made countless letters with images to friends. So that mindset of his between writing and image, a watercolor image or a sculpture, went hand in hand, and I think they complemented. They amplified, sometimes they may be intentionally confused or contradicted, but it seems to me his entire life, as a kid making cartoons with thought balloons up to, the very end, I think he consistently on a daily basis thought of drawing, lettering, writing, and making objects consistently.
I think, thinking about language again, I'm remembering something I thought earlier today, and I think there's like some element of like, people were talking about surrealism in relationship to the work, and these kind of like, that has the relationship of poetry or putting like two objects or images bluntly together to make something new. and even has a relationship to functional object and kind of countering a function of an object in sculpture. But I think the special thing that like forces these into like such an uncanny territory is that I don't see them as surreal, like related to surrealism. I see them as their own breed of kind of more of a social psychology rather than an individual, like internal psychology. I think it's like societal exterior pressure on the individual that can make this kind of an object. And I think there's not a lot of people who make work like that. And I think that that's why it's so hard to pin down.
What do you mean by that?
Like, surrealism is all about like dream, subconscious, kind of these kind of latent, hidden image relationships that happen in an individual. But it feels very insular, or like these all come from the self. And I feel like his work is very much exterior forces acting on the self. And I think that that's so I can't see a relationship to surrealism, but I think they're these special evolution of that kind of thought process and image making and kind of abutting things.
I agree with you. I think it's very social work in the sense that it engages with the realities of its time in a kind of almost, despite its kind of Gnostic secret holding, kind of this idea that there's something elusive about the work that you're not fully getting at. It does often express certain things related to the politics of the time. He was very much an anti-war. After serving in World War II and the Korean War, he had a very strong anti-war and anti-authoritarian sensibility. His son went on to enroll in the military and go to Vietnam, and after that, his work became even more overtly anti-war, I think. But I'm wondering what you make of this kind of channeling of social pressures or social concerns in the work, because it's also not didactic work, and I wouldn't say it's activist work in any way, but it does often relate to things that are going on at the time.
Well, I would agree with what Ingrid said about this distinction between surrealism and Westermann's work. He lived such a complex, I think, rich, troubled sometimes life, and he was close-lipped about much of that. I think with friends and family, I'm sure he conveyed his thoughts and his feelings. But I think for the art world, there was this skepticism, sometimes distrust. So I think by living in rather isolated circumstances in Connecticut for 20 years, making work in a rural area with his wife, his kid wasn't there, and his in-laws, I think that sort of cocoon of creativity allowed him to tap into his memory, life, experience, and make work that, was forceful. But I don't think he was making work that announced itself in the sense that, social critics automatically would. It was somehow held in, maybe more than would otherwise be if he was living in the middle of New York City or Los Angeles or Chicago.
Which weren't places he necessarily wanted to be. He wanted to be at a remove from the center of the art world in order to avoid cheapening the experience of his work, I think, because he felt a distrust for the work that was being produced in those places. I want to ask one last kind of fun question for you guys. What's your favorite, before we open it up for questions, because it's been so painful until now. Which of the works is your favorite?
I mean, we asked the question a little differently when we were in the galleries. I think we said, which one would you take home if you could?
Yeah, but you can't. Yeah.
No logistics involved. But I think I think it changes like every minute I'm in front of something else. Like I have such an attachment to all of them in such an interesting way, but the big change, I think, I don't know, there's something about it that's like so strange to me, but actually the little rat house, what is it called? Dovetail house.
Dovetailed house.
Ugh, that one. I think that's the one I'd have to live with. Yeah, it's strange. It gets me.
Well, it's hard. I mean, I think, in 10 minutes I'd give you a different answer, but maybe the world's strongest glue, it's a dopey sort of thing, but it's one material. It's the only cast metal in the show. He did a few others, but when he did, they were quite playful. And it's just automatically stupid. And for that reason.
Can I ask you one last question?
Sure.
After working on the show, do you feel like you know H.C. Westermann better or less?
No, well...
Like, do you feel like it's like, do you go enter it going, I know.
They're trying to silence me again. Interesting, do I feel like I know him better or less? I don't know. He strikes me as a person that it's possible to know a lot of things about, but very difficult to know. And the people who admired him, who knew him very well, who were artists, had tremendous respect for him, but also very much kept themselves at a respectful distance from him. I don't think he was a person who had many very close friends, even though he had very deep relationships. He strikes me as the kind of person that it would be a little bit foolish to say you knew them very well, I guess I'll say. Yeah, I think that he was not a very loquacious man. He was very warm, and he liked keeping in touch with people, but I think that there was a kind of core that remained very distant from the world, and I think that's also true about the works. I find them, or maybe that just informs how I look at the works, I find them to be full of a lot of interesting details and great things to look at and great things to think about and great ways of making them to speculate about, but I also find them to have a kind of interior nut that is really difficult to access and maybe doesn't need to be accessed.
Thank you.
Maybe that's a good place to end it.
Yeah.
Thanks.